In what ways was the geography of Eurasia better suited for the development of large civilizations than the Americas? What impacts were these differences to have on the development of cultures in the Americas? So really, the answers to this question very much come down to geography. And we've already talked about in the case of both the river valley civilizations, hunters-gatherers, people who adapted agriculture in the form of nomadic lifestyles, that people, given their geographic constraints and availability, oftentimes just make sort of very intelligent decisions based upon where they are. And the Americas are really no different. Um, and sort of the end result of all this is that large scale stratified states are essentially just going to make more sense in those areas of Eurasia that were well suited for it than in the Americas, even though there are a lot of exceptions to that. So why is that? Well, first of all, Eurasia is on sort of an east-west axis, meaning kind of Europe into the Middle East, into South Asia, the steppe-land regions, into China and East Asia. All of them are, for the most part, connected and pretty close to the same level of longitude. Which means that if something grows well in one climate, it's a fairly good chance that's going to grow well in a similar climate. And a lot of these locations across Eurasia have sort of very very similar climates. So you see things like wheat growing fairly successfully in multiple locations. Whereas being on a north-south axis, you can just think of kind of the difference in climate between like here in Florida, for example, or here in New Mexico or the Yucatan. And you can see that there's a real drastic shift. So the same crops aren't necessarily going to be quite as available and spread quite as easily potentially as they are in Eurasia. Same way with animals and so forth. Also, the Americas have a fairly dense geography. There's all sorts of mountains and deserts and forests that really sort of break things up. There's not like the uh, large open grasslands like you have in the steppeland region that connects various regions. We have the Great Plains, but even that is not even half the size of the steppeland region in Eurasia. Also, the availability of easily navigatable inland seas, that's also going to be helping out with travel and contact. So it's just a little bit easier for people to move around and contact one another. It doesn't mean that that doesn't happen in America, because there's tons and tons of population movements and commerce and trade. But it seems like it's a little more difficult for large-scale groups to move around in the Americas as it is in Eurasia. Eurasia also has a number of just sort of natural plants that are very ideal for domestication and are very well suited for supporting large populations. Wheat and barley, rice, millet. These are all going to be examples of grains that become used to really boost the populations of Eurasia and can sustain very large populations. Of course, the Americas have maize, they have beans, they have squash, you're going to have quinoa. These are going to be grains that are grains and other vegetables that are very much going to be the bedrock and the stone for agriculture in the Americas. But they're not going to be grown quite in large quantity and not quite as easy to get as large of harvests and so forth to support the large populations that you see in Eurasia. And perhaps even more importantly than the plants is the idea of domesticatable animals. There's a very small number of large land animals that are suitable for domestication, and all of them were in Eurasia. If you think about the entire nomad lifestyle being dependent upon the horse and horses, that meant that there was an entire sort of separate branch of agriculture that was developed in Eurasia that never developed in the Americas, at least until the contact period. The Great Plains might have been very well suited for something like that if there had been horses and large herding animals, but all those animals were in Eurasia. So the Great Plains in the Americas was primarily only occupied by hunters and gatherers, people who moved and followed herds, but weren't able to raise and sustain herds of their own, like you saw in the steppeland regions. But goats and sheep and pigs and cattle, All of these are going to be in Eurasia. None of them are going to be in the Americas. So there's a lot fewer land animals, and particularly land animals being used for meat and dairy, for hides, for clothing. Much fewer are going to be available. Really, the only land animal that's domesticated, or large land animals domesticated in the Americas, is going to be the llama. And that's very much geographically contained to the Andes mountain regions. Other animals were domesticated in the Americas. You have dogs, for example, were domesticated very early on, but they're not going to be something you can really use too dependently for transportation. They're not going to be able to be used really for a meal source or a food source. So the Americas are very much do not have as many options available for the utilization of land animals. That's also going to be another reason why it's going to keep their populations relatively smaller. There's not going to be a nomadic lifestyle that is developed there, but at the same point in time, it's going to lead to, for quite a while, the people of the Americas actually being relatively healthier. A lot of the sort of most infectious diseases that we have come from transmission from large land animals to people. So chickenpox, you can think of that as one example, or smallpox being another one. So those diseases aren't really going to be prevalent in the Americas. The huge downside to this, as you'll be learning in the second half of this class, is that after the contact period, when Europeans do come into sustained contact in the Americas, these diseases, which had been developing for thousands of years in kind of a biological arms race in Eurasia, is going to have an absolutely devastating effect on the Americas and the populations that live there. But until that time, it's somewhat makes the populations in the Americas a bit more healthy than those in Eurasia. So all this comes together to mean that large stratified states were fewer in number and smaller in scale in the Americas. Once more, it doesn't mean that they didn't exist, it just meant that they were somewhat less common and a little bit more geographically confined. Primarily, you're going to see these occurring in Central America and in the Andes Mountains region. These states are also relatively going to be less diverse in nature, as they're going to be very much sort of built upon a few kind of cultural archetypes, for example, the Olmec society, and you're going to see a lot of similarities in these populations and these civilizations that were developed in the same location, different iterations, but built upon sort of the same cultural models. Whereas you see in Eurasia, obviously, because there were more people in these large stratified states, more contact between these states, a much larger degree of variability with the peoples that were inhabiting these states. But it's also important, once more, to remember that the people who were not organizing themselves into large states were still doing so because it made sense to them. It doesn't make sense to build a city of 50,000 people if 20,000 people are going to be starving every year. So the fact that people were generally living in smaller political units and tribal or kin-based units, a lot of them were subsisting on more sort of seasonal subsistence patterns. Those were all because it made sense for their context and their environment, and they were very successful in doing that. The populations in the Americas overall are actually very healthy, and comparing sort of the land size to Eurasia to the Americas, they're right up there. It's not like they are underpopulated, I would say, and the American Indians who are in the Americas spread to essentially every corner of habitable land that there is. So it definitely shows you sort of the success that they had. There was large civilizations. They sort of that certainly mirror those that we see in Eurasia, but there are the differences of sort of the size and the scale of those that do develop. What are some of the similarities you notice between the early civilizations in the Americas? Why do you think these cultures developed in such similar ways? The class did a very good job sort of picking out a lot of these commonalities. They realized that there was sort of a common mythology that seemed to have been built up between a lot of these cultures, where they followed similar gods, similar importance of sort of animal-human hybrids in their gods, somewhat similar to what we saw within Egypt, the importance of jaguars within sort of being a sort of sacred animal within these religions, also sort of very common. Also, people pointed out the importance of water, and sort of a part of that, the sort of ideology of sacrifice and blood sacrifice as being important to the mythologies and the religious practices of these varying groups. And that's a very good observation as well. That they very much did have that connotation between sort of releasing blood, either from the rulers and the leaders, or in a sort of a sacrifice by killing prisoners and so forth. And that's going to have very long, sort of lasting effects, and certainly was part of the religious ideology of a lot of these. Now, a lot of people, you know, tend to look at this as being very sort of shocking. The fact that they would, actually sacrifice humans for their religion. And I've read a few accounts trying to sort of contemplate the Mayans and why this development was so prevalent with the Mayans. And there's an interesting idea that sacrifices, particularly in the form of sort of captured soldiers, was actually more of a survival mechanism with the sort of political culture which developed. Remember, the Mayans were very much constructed and built upon a lot of smaller competing city-states. And remember, this was a region where resources were relatively slim. The water resources were very scarce, and you had to be very careful how much water you collected. And simply, these city-states couldn't sustain large-scale conflict and warfare between each other. So what ultimately ends up happening is that really warfare becomes primarily for trying to capture enemy warriors for these sort of sacrificial rituals, and ultimately ends up leading to much smaller conflicts between the city-states, where you have essentially warriors going out just to fight other warriors to try to capture them for these rituals, and you do not see these sort of large-scale um, sort of total war systems that you see certain cases in Eurasia. Total war is a much more sort of modern term, but the large-scale conquests and all-out battles that you can see across Eurasia, much less common between these Mayan city-states. And the idea was that sort of this ritual of sacrifice was a way to actually limit and contain those conflicts, so they were going to be much smaller in scale and nature, and not sort of put the entire civilization at risk of outstripping their resources. If that's 100% true or not, I'm not sure, but it gives you another idea of sort of picturing this idea of sacrifice. And certainly, I would say on the surface, there's nothing terribly I would say more inhumane for what the Mayans were doing here, as far as capturing a few warriors in battle to sacrifice them, as opposed to looking at the battlefields of World War I, when hundreds of thousands of soldiers are being essentially uselessly slaughtered. I think you can easily say that there's nothing necessarily better about one than the other, but certainly one is much smaller in the scale, and one is much larger in scale. So a little bit of perspective, but certainly on the surface, it certainly does seem very odd and concerning to us looking back at it from our modern day perspective. A lot of these civilizations also had the creation and use of pyramids. For religious purposes, and once more, very similar to the reasons why the Egyptians were creating them, fitting in with their mythology. A lot of times the pyramids were also based upon the very advanced astronomical observations that the Mayans were able to conduct. So aligning their pyramids so that during the solstices, certain things would happen. For example, one pyramid you have sort of a snake coiling down. It looks like the shadow of it, eventually lining up with a giant serpent head at the bottom during the equinox. So some very advanced building technology is being used here, combining with sort of their very sort of astral perception of the universe to create some of these pyramids. And you see that very much, from the Olmecs through Monte Alban, through the Maya, to Teotihuacan, all the way to eventually the Mexica, are going to be having these very much hallmarks of their civilizations. The importance of that ball game, once more, having to do somewhat with sort of sacrificial nature, but also just sort of a ritual nature behind it. That seems to be replicated, as many of these cities throughout the ages have various iterations of these ball courts. Also, just the fact that they were very much built into large cities and large states. A lot of people also pointed out the importance of jade and turquoise as sort of ritual jewels and objects, also being important to multiple iterations of these civilizations. And sort of getting back to the last question, the main reason why these cultures developed in such a similar way is that they were essentially in a very sort of similar location. There's not a ton of geography separating where these various cultures are developing. And also, there's not a ton of outside contact with other large stratified states. There's some contact with the Andes Mountains region. There's some contact with the Pueblos in the southwest portions of what is today the United States, sort of the southwestern portions of North America. There's large population centers there, but not like the large trade and contact that was going back and forth between the civilizations we've talked about in Eurasia. So these civilizations are much more sort of insulated and don't have, as many sort of exchange of ideas and other examples of how to do things. So they all sort of do things in a very sort of similar manner throughout time. But also, it's something that essentially worked for a lot of these civilizations. And in most cases, if something's not broke, people aren't just going to randomly fix it. And if this was essentially a cultural system and a life way that was meeting the needs of the people within these civilizations and societies, it's not overly surprising that they're going to be recurring once and again throughout time. I would like you to choose 3 artistic artifacts which were displayed and discussed this week. Give a brief description of each artifact and describe how and why you think the artifact was important to the people who created it. I thought there was a very good cross-section of what we had been talking about throughout the chapter today. Some people brought up the jade were-jaguar baby and sort of the ritual nature of that item, and also just the fact that it looks pretty scary for a kind of little stone figure. But also how you can definitely tell that a lot of skill had been put into making and creating it. A lot of people also mentioned the stone Olmec heads, still sort of trying to figure out what ritualistic purpose that they had or fulfilled, but sort of how much they were a hallmark of the Olmec populations. Obsidian knives being another item that people brought up, and sort of how you can certainly tell these civilizations are taking advantage of all the resources at their disposal, and obsidian becomes one of the primary tools for weapons and cutting items in these various civilizations in Central America. People also brought up the murals and stone relief frescoes showing the sacrifice and sort of the warfare of the Maya. Once more, sort of reiterating how important that idea of bloodletting was to their religion and sort of worldview. A lot of people also brought up the calendar, how the calendar was so significant to the Maya, and how really trying to figure out exactly when they were in sort of their own cosmological history to pinpoint exact important dates and so forth was very much a very sophisticated system that they had developed, and showing that these calendars, which would align with one another, sort of a ritual calendar and a yearly calendar and a long count calendar, and how they would really sort of combine these various calendars together to fulfill their sort of ideological needs is pretty interesting. So a lot of people had fun bringing that item up. A lot of people also pointed to the moche pottery. With sort of very bright and vibrant pictures there, some of them sort of erotic in nature, some of them being more tactile, some of them seeming just sort of fun and whimsical. Very much the moche were some of the sort of the most creative pottery makers that we've talked about thus far in class. A lot of people enjoyed looking at those various creations. And the Nazca geoglyphs, also a lot of people brought those up as far as being very indicative of the Nazca populations and how they're able to sort of artistically use these tools for mapping out things in the desert that they lived by, finding resources and water and so forth, but being able to do it in sort of a very sort of picturesque way. So overall, very good job picking out these various items this week, and yeah, keep up the good work. All right, describe the importance of water and the importance of time to the Mayan civilization. Why do you believe the elements of water and time became so important to the Maya? And certainly looking at this question, a lot of people pointed out just kind of the simple fact that water is incredibly important because without water you don't have food or animals or humans in general. So pretty much all of the large stratified states that we've talked about have been very close to water. We talked about, the Mesopotamians being between the rivers, how important the Nile was to the Egyptians, the Indus River Valley, the Yellow River. These are all societies that grew up next to very large rivers that would bring very fertile soil down to them. The Maya essentially were in a very different geographical location. They're on a karst plain with a lot of limestone, very few rivers. A lot of the fresh water that they could get access to were in these sort of like underwater caves called cenotes. Um, and certainly a very different geographic location than the large river valley civilizations that we've been discussing thus far. And that meant that the Mayans had to get very creative with their water management. Or the Mayans, the Olmec, and future civilizations in the region as well. They're all going to be needing to rely upon this. So ultimately, the sort of answer to this is a wide variety of hydraulic engineering is developed by the Mayans. So the creation of all sorts of wells, cisterns, aqueducts, dams. They would drain swamps, trying to find every way to collect rainwater, to redistribute that rainwater, to bring that rainwater to their crops and their plants. So they had to be very, very creative and intentional with their water management through the use of this hydraulic engineering. They use in the video Tikal as an example that a city was created where there's essentially no natural fresh water anywhere near, and that they had to create these large sort of reservoirs based upon collecting rainwater near the city to support the city throughout time. Also, the ability to control water really sort of symbolized wealth and power to the Maya and to other Mesoamerican populations and civilizations. The entire idea and concept of these holy lords seems to have been tied to the ability to control and redistribute this water. Also, they point out how important aquatic iconography is in the murals and so forth that the Mayans created, how it's certainly seen as a very precious and important element. The idea sort of behind the Holy Lords is the fact that they had sort of control water, and then people would give them tribute in exchange essentially for access to that water during the rainy season, which they point out was sort of a precarious position because if there's a drought or something like that, it can certainly sort of undercut your ability to uphold that system. Also, the very close relationship between water and blood, which we've already talked about, I think you can certainly sort of bring in here as well. So, as far as the reasoning behind this, you're in a scenario where your population is based upon agriculture, and the only way you're going to support this large population size is with agriculture, and you realize that your agriculture is based upon a very tenuous ability to collect rainwater. You're sort of always living at the edge. It's certainly going to bring up the importance of water to fulfill and grow those crops, grow the maize, the beans, the squash, to support those large civilizations throughout time. And it seems like there was a very similar relationship with their calendar systems, which were developed. Of course, the Maya developed a very complicated and complex writing system with a lot of varying hieroglyphs and things of that nature. They developed a very complex mathematical system based on units of 20. They developed the concept of zero, which I'm not a mathematician, so I can't tell you why exactly that's so cool, but I know mathematicians get really geeked out when someone develops the concept of zero, so it's pretty important for math. Ask mathematicians, they'll tell you more about why that is. They also created all sorts of very large calculation tables, particularly to try to work with and solve the mysteries of their incredibly complex calendar system. Their calendar systems are based on all sorts of astronomical observations. The Maya have some of the most advanced knowledge of astronomy in the ancient world. Planets such as Venus were incredibly important to them, as well as the solstices and the equinox. And they were very, very advanced as far as their understanding of sort of the universe around us. And playing into this was their creation of this incredibly detailed calendar system, which could essentially calculate dates for thousands, tens of thousands, and hundreds of thousands of years, and sort of pinpoint exactly where they were in this very sort of long time pattern and time system. It became very important to sort of the Mayan priesthoods to try to pinpoint specific future dates in the calendar which were of significance, where festivals and important alignments of their calendars would be taking place, and to sort of make those very important events. So these are some of the reasons why sort of the concept of water and time ultimately becomes so important to the Maya, as well as later, civilizations in the region as well. What combination of technology, supplies, and know-how were necessary for Austronesian and Polynesian mariners to sail to the remote Pacific islands? First of all, technology-wise, they certainly needed to have the large ocean-going canoes, which made the voyage possible. And as time goes on, these canoes become larger. Sometimes they're equipped with sails. They're also oftentimes sort of twin-hulled with a deck connecting them, so you'd have sort of two canoes on either side with a plank sort of in the middle, which would be relatively stable on the large open ocean. Um, as far as supplies go, the use of agriculture becomes very important to these voyages. The fact that they could bring pigs and chickens, yams, breadfruit, bananas, all along with them and set those up, harvesting and conducting agriculture on the various islands throughout the Pacific becomes very important to their survival as well. And as far as know-how goes, it's really just sort of navigation knowledge, knowledge of wind patterns, currents. Astronomy becomes very important to these navigators to figure out what direction they are heading. Also, just watching the flight patterns of birds to figure out, where a close island may or may not be, how far out from land types of birds typically will go, so it can give you an idea of potentially how close to land you are. And really, all these combined to make it so that essentially all the Pacific Islands are populated by about 300 CE or so, and that populations got from the islands off of Eurasia all the way over to Hawaii and Easter Island, by a very early date. So you can see that all these three aspects combined to really allow people to explore and settle and populate these islands to a very large degree. All right, on to our document exercise for this week. Looking at question number 1, to what extent does the account of human creation reflect the influence of Maya society, of agriculture, and the untamed natural world? And a lot of people did a very good job in sort of showing the impact and importance of water once again here to the Maya, as water is essentially used to create, in their belief, the blood of people. For example, it's quotes, water was their blood, it was the blood of humanity. And of course, agriculture being another key link here, right? I mean, essentially, agriculture is based upon water, and agriculture, essentially in the form of white and yellow maize, is going to be the sort of building blocks of humans' flesh here. Thus was found the food that would become the flesh of the newly framed and shaped people. You also have the importance of animals, the fox, coyote, parakeet, raven, and how essentially they are the ones who sort of show the gods, these sort of two progenitor gods, where to find the materials to make these people in sort of this mountain filled with delicious food. There's chocolate there, there's honey there, but there's also the maize and the water that's necessary to sort of create these people. So certainly you can see how important water as well as agriculture and sort of the natural ecological surroundings were to the Maya in the creation of this myth. So what role do you think that this creation myth may have played in Maya society? Well, certainly it was an explanation, right? An explanation of where people came from, how they were created, how they populated the earth. It also shows sort of the role of the gods, the fact that the gods, at least in this story, were fairly beneficial to humans, right? That they were the ones who were sort of looking for this way to create humans. They sort of have this idea of wanting humans to take over. So once more, it's this sort of idea that humans sort of have rights to take over the land and the earth. That's very much sort of prevalent here. But also you can see how eventually those ideas of bloodletting and why sort of water becomes so important in sort of religion and tied to sort of blood, because essentially minds believe that, well, their blood was essentially just this water that was sort of granted to them by the gods, and that they were essentially created out of. So when they want to make an offering back to the gods, then it is oftentimes in the form of returning that sort of water to the gods in the form of bloodletting. So how does this creation story compare to other creation stories that we have studied this semester, or creation stories that we are familiar with? A lot of people did a good job tying this back in with the account of either Gilgamesh or the Nile, sort of how the Nile River was sort of this progenitor of all good things, and how these gods were sort of seen as, of course, the progenitor of humanity. A lot of people also brought in stories from sort of the Abrahamic tradition, whether it was through a biblical account or accounts in the Quran and Islamic accounts of how sort of Adam and Eve were the progenitors in the creation Genesis. Showing sort of that humans were created from something, that they didn't just sort of pop up, that some sort of higher being or force or power created them. In this case, is of course being created out of maize and water. Other accounts and stories have humans being created out of clay or dust or sand, depending on sort of what version and what religion you are basing it on. Other religions, from other cultures have gods essentially sort of being created by other gods. Sometimes the world has to be created by essentially sort of killing a sort of primordial god and creating the world and the structure and the bones from them. It doesn't get quite as in depth with this account as to that. It seems like most of the natural world was already there before, and then humans were introduced. So in that case, it is very much sort of similar, I would say, to those accounts in Genesis and so forth. Also, the idea of sort of two primogeniture figures. In this document they refer to them as she who born children and he who has begotten sons. You can sort of make an equivalency between them and sort of like an Adam and Eve figure, right? That there's some correlations there. And also the fact that in both of those creation stories, humanity was tasked with populating the earth and peopling the earth. And certainly this is going to be much closer to sort of a much more of a that account from this Abrahamic traditions than, say, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, where, yes, some of the gods like to help the humans, but then the gods also are going to come down and mess around with the humans and sometimes try to kill them and exterminate them. And it seems like there's a much more friendly link between sort of the creator gods and human beings in this mythology than there was, for example, in the Mesopotamian mythologies. Closer probably to Egyptian mythology as well in that case. So overall, I thought the class did a good job sort of breaking these documents down, bringing in their own prior knowledge, and putting it all together.